So today we're going to cover 5 more amazing builds for Elden Ring PVE. Now as always, I'm just going to cover weapons of which I haven't really made a build on before. If you do want to see a build around a particular type of weapon, more likely than not I have already done it. You can just go check out my build playlist. Now all the gameplay that you will be seeing will be at level 150 against endgame bosses, but I will show you how to build around it at level 80 as well. But yeah, with that out of the way, let's just get into it. The claymore is such a solid and reliable weapon in this game. It has an amazing moveset, it gets really nice range and damage, but yeah, specifically those heavy attacks is what makes this really good. It does get a really quick poking attack, which poking attacks are amazing because they're typically faster, have more range, and they'll do piercing damage, which can be one of the best, if not the best damage type in the entire game. But we're going to pair this weapon alongside an intelligence build with a magic infusion. We're going to have Carrion and Grandeur infused onto this. Now Carrion Grandeur is an S tier Ash War in this game. It does so much damage, and it can just chase a bunch of different types of bosses. But how it works is that for 26 FP, you summon this greatsword, and it has 3 different charges. The longer you hold onto the button, the more it actually gets charged up, and when you have it fully charged, it can just do monstrous damage, go really far, and actually do really high stance damage too. Now the major downside of this is that you don't get hyper armor, and it is going to obviously be a longer animation, so you're gonna have to really pick and choose your openings as to when you can use this thing. Being that it actually does have a lot of range, you honestly can just use it at any point, but the best way to use it will be to like poise break an enemy first, and instead of going with the riposte, you just fully charge this skill instead, and you can just do even more damage, which is the reason as to why I went with the greatsword, because this actually is pretty decent at poise breaking, especially when you just spam charged heavy attacks, which the claymore has a really good heavy attack. Now you might think that the claymore doesn't actually scale well with magic with its C scaling and intelligence, but that C scaling is kind of deceptive. It actually does scale pretty decently in intelligence. I don't really know why it still gets a C scaling. But to boost the damage of Carrion Grandeur, we're actually going to have the Spellblade set, which every single piece will actually improve the damage by an additional 2%. We're going to have the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon. When fully charged, it's just going to make it do even more damage. We're also going to have the Axe Talisman equipped because we're going to be spamming a bunch of charged heavy attacks to get the poise break. Now if you did just want to spam the weapon skill, you don't really need the Axe Talisman, and then in that case you could just put on the Magic Scorpion Charm instead. That is going to make you take more damage, but if you're confident, it's just going to make you do even more damage, so you might as well just use that one instead. We're also going to go with the Graven Mass Talisman. This is going to boost our spell damage by 8%. Obviously, being that we're actually going with an intelligence build, we might as well use some sorceries. Now at this level of which I'm at right now at 70, the Carrion Regal Scepter is going to be the best. The Lusat Staff is going to be better, but that actually does consume more FP for our spells, so I just like to go with the Carrion Regal Scepter. Now being that our Ash War is literally going to be doing more damage than all these other spells, we don't really need much. So the main ones is going to be Rani's Dark Moon. This actually does debuff enemies to make them take more magic damage and do a bunch of frost buildup, of which we're going to pair that alongside Zamor Ice Storm. This spell can actually proc frost faster than almost anything else in the entire game. And proccing frost is just going to debuff the enemy to make them take even more damage, and that actually will stack with the Rani's Dark Moon. Now if you were struggling to use as a more Ice Storm because you didn't know how to get close to an enemy, you can just use the Glintstone Ice Crag instead. We're also going to have Knight's Comet just to have some type of projectile option if you did want to hit enemies at a distance. And you can use something like Magma Shot or Rock Sling if you do go up against enemies that are resist to magic damage. But Terra Magica as well is going to be one of the main options. Just creates a pool of magic, and when standing inside of it, you're doing 35% more magic damage, which that is obviously going to pair really nicely with Carrion Grandeur. And as for our Wondrous Flask, we're obviously going to have more intelligence and more magic damage. And as always, if you're not going with a faith build, just have Golden Vow infused onto a dagger, throw that into your back pocket. Before you go into a boss fight, just use the buff. Power stancing combos that hit at the exact same time are just always going to be amazing. It is basically outputs the most amount of damage in a little amount of time, and straight swords do it just as well as almost anything else in the game. Those jumping attacks into light attack combos are extremely deadly. So we're basically going to be playing around that today using the Warhawk Talon and the Lordsworn Straightsword. Now the Lordsworn Straightsword can be replaced with the regular longsword in this type of build, because at higher levels the longsword is actually going to outdamage it with a dexterity type of build, of which we are going with. But there are going to be a few benefits with the Lordsworn Straightsword, is that one does get more range and it does get a 110 crit. So if you're in an instance where you can get a riposte or a backstab, you can just switch to this weapon and it'll end up doing more damage. But as for our main hand, we're actually going to go have the Warhawk Talon, which this actually does get some of the most range and some of the most damage in its class. But the main reason we're going to be using it is due to its heavy attack. It does get a unique double swiping attack, which does get some really nice range and just output more damage than all the other straight sword heavies. Now your regular light attack combos are just going to output more damage and just have better DPS. But the benefit of using a heavy attack is to stagger those larger types of enemies that you otherwise couldn't with a light attack, like Omens or Lendel Knights. And it also just does do more stance damage as well. So being that we're just going to spam heavy and light attacks, we don't really need weapon skills, of which we're just going to have a Cragblade infused onto it. This is going to give us 15% more physical damage and 10% more stance damage. And in our offhands with a lordsworn straight sword, we can actually go have this with the Cragblade as well. But I'm actually going to go with Braggart's Roar. Now this is going to be another weapon buff. It's not going to give as big as a boost as Cragblade does. It is only 10%, but actually does give you 10% more defenses and 20% faster stamina recovery speed, which that stamina recovery speed is going to be really nice to have with a power stancing build, because power stancing combos can cost a lot of stamina, which is why, as you see with this build, I go spec into more endurance than I normally would. Now this type of playstyle might be a bit annoying, constantly having to have both of your weapons buffed, but honestly these things can do such amazing damage even without their buffs. I'd only really save the double buff for a boss. I probably just use Braggart's Roar every single time you do like engage like a tougher type of enemy, because the buffs of what you do have are really not that necessary. And if you do feel like you are lacking a projectile option, you can just equip Stormblade onto the warhawk talon, and that could be really nice. But I feel like if you want to maximize your DPS potential, this is going to be the best play. Which, speaking of which, our talismans, we're going to have the Millicent Prosthesis and the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia, which both of these talismans actually do boost your damage with consecutive attacks. And being that we're hitting multiple times very quickly with these weapons, it's just going to make for an obvious pairing. We're also going to have the Thorny Cracks tier, because all of these things are stacked with one another and just basically work the exact same way. Now, unfortunately, you can't actually get to the Millicent Prosthesis and the Rotten Winged Sword Insignia in the same playthrough. It does require you to go to New Game Plus. So in that instance, I just recommend going with the regular sword insignia and stacking that with the Millicent Prosthesis. Now we are also going to go with the Axe Talisman, which is going to boost our charge attack damage. That's going to also stack with the Spiked Cracks tier we have on. And we're also going to go with the Claw Talisman alongside the Raptor Feathers chest piece. Both of these are going to improve our jumping attack damage, and as I mentioned before, the jumping attack into the light attack combo is extremely powerful. As you might have noticed, I do have a dagger in my back pocket, just has Golden Vow onto it. Before I do fight a boss, I just use the buff, then switch back to my main weapons. And I also do have a seal with Flame Grant Me Strength as well, because that is going to be even more damage if you need that. It's not really that necessary. It does require you to spec into 15 Faith. So it's maybe something for like later levels, but it is going to help you melt a lot of bosses. But yeah, the build itself is just going into a bunch of health, stamina, and dexterity. The Silurias tree is a holy-based Great Spear, and Great Spears are some of the better weapon classes in the game. Really good light attack combo, nothing but poking attacks, really high amounts of stance damage, they get some nice range. Now typically they tend to lack more horizontal types of swipes, but the Silurias tree is actually really good because the heavy attack is going to be a horizontal swipe. So if you did want to hit multiple enemies at once, or if you're trying to hit skinnier types of enemies, this heavy attack is going to be really solid. But the best thing about this weapon is going to be its skill Silurias Woe. Does do this cool little short range AoE attack, does some nice damage, a little bit of stance damage, but when fully charged, it turns it into this massive projectile that goes through enemies and goes really far, and obviously just does amazing damage. You actually can play around this weapon two different ways, either going into strength or going into faith, depending on what you really want. If you just didn't really care much about using spells, then going all into strength is just going to be the best bet, because you're just going to get more damage out of the weapon, and the weapon skill does scale off AR, so you can actually just get more damage out of the weapon skill as well. But if you actually did care to use more spells, I recommend going into a bunch of faith, which is going to do less damage with the weapon, although it's not going to be by that much because it still gets a pretty decent faith scaling. But it means that you just can get way more damage out of your spells than you otherwise would with the Claw Mark seal, which is what I did here with this build. I went to about 60 faith and only 30 strength, which I think is still a pretty decent split because you can two-hand the weapon to just further improve your strength. And this way you can actually just still get really good spell damage too. But as for the talismans, we're going to have the Shard of Alexander and the Godfrey's Icon. Both of these things are going to boost the skill damage. Also going to have the Carrion Filigree Crest. Actually does decrease the FP cost from 25 to 19, which is very nice if you do want to spam it. And we're going to have the Flox Canvas Talisman to boost the incantation damage by 8%. And we're going to have the Godslayer seal too. This is going to be the best seal to have between 27 and 69 faith. And in terms of our incantations, you don't really need much, being that you already have a pretty decent projectile option. But I went with O-Flame if I just wanted to go up against enemies that are weaker to fire damage, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike against those really large enemies or enemies weaker to lightning, or even just resist to holy damage. Scarlet Aeonia is just really nice to have in every single boss fight. You can use it right at the beginning, and it can just instantly proc Scarlet Rot, and enemies will just end up taking a bunch of percentile damage over time, and you could end up just draining like almost 30% of an enemy's health bar in a couple of minutes. And we're also going to use Black Blade as well. This also does amazing percentile damage over time, and it could just shred larger bosses very quickly. I definitely recommend using this spell if you are in New Game Plus. And it's going to pair nicely alongside our Wondrous Flask because we are going to have the Faith and the Holy base tier. Both of these things are just going to further improve our weapon and a lot of our spell damage. Now, if you didn't really care to use spells much and you were going to go mainly into strength, I wouldn't bother using the Holy tier because you're not going to really benefit off much damage. But being that we're speccing into more faith, that actually does improve our Holy damage, so the Holy tier just makes more sense here. But as for the rest of the spells, obviously Golden Vow and Flame grant me strength. Obviously, most of our weapon is doing holy damage, so the flame growing strength isn't going to benefit much, but it still is going to be a little bit more damage and faster stamina recovery speed. But basically how you want to use this build is just spam the weapon skill until you go up against an enemy or boss that is very resist to holy damage, like 80%, someone like Malekith or Radabeast. Then in that case, you could just use either Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike or Catch Flame. The Morningstar is one of the better hammers in Elden Ring. It gets some of the highest damage, it gets passive bleed, and it also does get to the best moveset as well, because it does get access to a bunch of poking attacks. The rolling attack, the running heavy, and even the last light attack of the combo actually does do a poke, which all of these attacks are just much faster than the regular hammer moveset. Now, hammers themselves aren't going to get crazy DPS, but one thing that actually do really well is actually have really high stance damage, so we're actually going to play into that. Now, the best way to stance break is going to be using charged heavy attacks or guard counters, of which hammers have really fast heavy attacks and really fast guard counters. So it's just going to pair really nicely with this type of build. Now, to further improve the stance damage, we're actually going to infuse the Morningstar with Cragblade, which does add 10% more stance damage to the weapon, and also add 15% more physical damage, which our weapon is going to be pure physical damage. We're going to have it occult infused, which yes, it actually will be doing more damage with a strength type of infusion, but the difference isn't even that bad. This thing actually does get a pretty decent arcane scaling with an occult infusion, so it ends up being about like 10 to 20 AR difference. But the main reason to go with an occult infusion is because this actually does get passive bleed, so when speccing into a lot of arcane, it actually thoroughly improves the blood loss buildup, of which bleed is going to be one of the best status effects to have in the entire game. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to be using guard counters, so obviously we're going to have a shield, and medium shields are honestly like just as good as like having any other shield in this game. They can block 100% physical damage, and they can get almost just as much guard boost as some great shields. Now, the best medium shield in the game is going to be the brass shield. It does actually get the highest amount of guard boost, but we're actually going to go with the blue gold kite shield because this one actually does get lower requirements. The brass shield requires 16 strength, this one only requires 12 strength, and you don't have to farm for this one as well. So just to save a little bit of points into strength, this one is going to be perfectly fine, and it only gets like a little bit less guard boost. But we're going to have this one infused with Barricade Shield, which this Ash of War is absolutely incredible. It's this very quick blocking animation for only 12 FP, and it basically just buffs your shield to just be able to tank more attacks and not really lose as much stamina. And obviously every single time that you block, then you click the heavy attack button, you're going to do the guard counter attack, of which with hammers, they're really quick, and it's going to do high amounts of stance damage. Now, obviously to build around this playstyle, we're going to have to use the curved sword talisman, which improves guard counter attacks, the axe talisman for charged heavy attacks, the dagger talisman, which actually boosts our critical attack damage every single time that we do get a stance break. Getting the riposte will just result in a lot of damage. And the last talisman slot can be somewhat flexible. I went with the Lord of Blood Exaltation, which makes it that every single time that you do proc bleed nearby on an enemy, you actually get a 20% damage boost for the next 20 seconds. And this actually also does stack with the white mask, of which we do also have equipped, which has a very similar effect. But if you are going to go up against an enemy that is actually resist to bleed, then you could probably switch to like the Ritual Sword Talisman, maybe switch to the Dragon Crest Shield Talisman if you just want more damage negation, if you feel like you're taking too much damage, or even the Flux Canvas Talisman to boost your incantation damage, because being that we have an arcane type of build, we might as well throw in the Dragon Communion Seal and use a bunch of spells. Of which, to meet the requirements for some of these spells, you're going to have to spec into a little bit of Faith. I have 15 Faith right now. I also do have the Faith tier. So if I do go up against a certain type of boss, I can just drink my flask and I'll gain 25 Faith, of which I can use things like Golden Vow, and I can use a bunch of different type of projectile incantations like Lightning Spear. I do have Dragonmore as well as a nice damaging option, although I do also recommend using the cheaper version of the Dragon Communion incantations. These Dragon Breath attacks can be extremely devastating. I like using Dragon Ice the most because it just does proc Frost. And I also do have Pest Threads for when I end up going up against larger types of bosses because it melts them really quickly. And also have Flame Gummy Strength to just further boost your damage, and having Catch Flame as well if you go up against enemies that are weaker to fire damage. Now, if you didn't really care to use spells, you could just go all into Strength and pair this with a heavy type of infusion, and I'd probably sacrifice some of those points in mind and put them into Endurance instead, because having more Endurance means that you actually can block more attacks. I probably should actually put more Endurance into this build. I probably recommend about 25, because having Endurance is really good. The Ghizas Will is a bleed-based colossal weapon that actually does scale off both your strength and dexterity equally. But for us, we're actually going to go all into strength when building around this. Even though you actually will get some more damage going into equal stats, the reason we're going all into strength is because there is no dexterity seal or staff. So if actually you do want to benefit off spells and get some nice spell damage, we're just going to go all into strength. Now, if you don't really care about spells, then just going split even strength and dexterity is perfectly fine. Now, colossal weapons, I don't really care much for them. They tend to have pretty slow movesets, not that high DPS, and their stance damage can be kind of average sometimes. Even great hammers can get more stance damage and just have faster movesets. But the Ghizas will actually like this one a lot because it actually does get a unique effect with its heavy attack and its skill. Now, the skill is actually Spinning Will, of which it just spins the wheel around a whole bunch, and it can actually output a bunch of damage. Now, there are going to be a few problems with this. It actually doesn't work with the multi-hits talismans, like Millicent Prosthesis and the Sword Insignia, and it also is just bugged against larger types of enemies. If you decide to use it against larger bosses, or even just slightly larger bosses, the wheel just does not spin very fast at all, and you're just doing like literally less than a quarter of the damage. But if you do fight those smaller types of enemies, then this thing could just be absolutely deadly. You can just shred them so quickly. But there actually is going to still be a way to do some very nice damage against those bosses that actually does bug out against, and that is going to be the heavy attack, because the multi-hit talismans actually do work with this heavy attack. Now, the unfortunate part is that you're going to have to use it one-handed, because the two-handed heavy attack does not stay in that same spot. The one-handed heavy attack just slams down in the one location, of which those spinning effects will come into play a lot more. And as you can see, if you just do land the entire combo, you could do a whole bunch of damage, and being that the weapon actually does get bleed, you're proccing bleed pretty quickly too. So to build around this, obviously going to have the Shard of Alexander. If you are fighting those larger types of bosses, I would recommend putting on the Millicent Prosthesis instead. We're also going to have the Rotten Wing Sword Insignia. Now, unfortunately, you can't get both of those multi-hit talismans in the same playthrough, so going with the regular Sword Insignia talisman is going to be the alternative. We're also going to go with a Thorny Cracked tier as well. Basically works the exact same way as the talismans, and it is going to stack. Unfortunately, you get it later in the playthrough, so I probably recommend going with the Strength or Dexterity tier until you actually do acquire it. We're also going to go with the Axe Talisman, which is going to boost our charge attack damage, and paired alongside the Spiked Cracked tier as well. And we're also going to have the Lord of Blood Exaltation and the White Mask. Both of these things will just boost your damage every single time that you do proc bleed. Now, if you do go up against an enemy that is immune to bleed, I recommend just putting on something to boost your neutral game, like a Damage Negation Talisman or a Stamina Boosting Talisman. Now, as I did mention earlier, being that we are going to go into a Strength-based build and using the Claw Mark Seal, might as well use some spells. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into much faith. I just went to 25 faith to use Golden Vow. You don't really need to go this high. You can just use the Golden Vow Ash of War and probably stay at about 17 faith, because at 17 faith, you can use Lightning Spear and Catch Flame, of which both of these are perfectly fine to have. They're not going to do amazing damage, but just having a nice projectile option and just having an elemental option is always going to be really good. Anyway, that concludes the list. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. And if you do have any types of builds that you want to see in particular that you haven't already seen on my builds playlist, you can just let me know as a request in the comments also. And do follow me on Twitch as well, because I am live there every single day doing a bunch of challenge runs. So if that does interest you, definitely give me a follow there. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.